Good morning, students. Good morning, colleagues. I'm Candice Chetty, and I'm a counselor at the Durban office. I'll be assisting with the question and answer as we go forward. Thank you.
Good morning, student, and good morning, colleagues. My name is Dumelo Mukwena. I'm a student counselor at Pietermaritzburg office. I'm also servicing Newcastle office.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you to our workshop for today. Our workshop for today will be presented by Dr. Hendricks. It's based on grief and loss. I believe that since we are all here, we all have lost people that we love, people that have been close to us, friends, colleagues, family members, etc. So this workshop of today is based on that, how to deal with grief. So we have Dr. Hendricks, who's well trained, who's well qualified to take us through to all these stages of healing. I think the workshop of today, and I hope that we're all going to learn something out of it, because grief is a very, 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 very crucial stage that we encounter in our lives.
Thank you so much, Program Director, and for that introduction. I think they were wise words, especially the point around every one of us who are in this workshop would have encountered loss, whether it's through death, and today's focus really is on death as a form of loss, even though we've experienced many types of losses. And so, yeah, we've all encountered over the last 3 years, I think more than ever, we've encountered several losses, but today's workshop really is going to focus on death, and that's a very it's a painful kind of loss. It's a loss that one takes a very, very long time to get over, right? And I also want to just, before I start fully, I want to just say that at the end, I would prefer it if you don't bring too many personal questions into the discussion. And I'd rather caution you and say, rather book, if you're really struggling with your grief, if through this presentation you realize that, sure, I'm still in this particular stage of grief, I haven't even begun to address it, or I have a delayed grief reaction, whatever the case may be, I'm going to urge you to then make an appointment with a counselor in your region and start talking to that person, right? This workshop is not here, it's not meant to help you resolve your grief, but it's to help you identify your own grief process and what's going on. So without any further ado, let me just go on to the PowerPoint. And as Program Director said, we're talking about grief and loss today. So a lot of people don't understand what is grief and what is loss and what is mourning and what is bereavement and all of that, right? We know that there's a renowned author who talks about grief, and he says that we live in a grief illiterate world. He says that grief is something we do on the inside, right? But mourning is something we do on the outside, because nobody can see our grief, right? We all grieve in our own unique ways. Each one of us, our grieving is so unique, it's as unique as somebody's fingerprint, right? So just keep that in mind about grief and mourning, because I want you to be able to understand out of this workshop today, what is grief and what is bereavement? How does one grieve for someone who is dying? You know, somebody who hasn't died yet, but they have a terminal illness or they're on life support. And many of us would have encountered that with loved ones during the COVID pandemic. Those of us who've had family members, parents and siblings who've had cancer and other terminal illness like HIV and so forth, would have watched them die, which is a very difficult and painful thing to do as a human being. And you wonder how much more is, you know, of pain and distress and heartache can I take. So I'm going to talk to you about the types of grief. Then I'm going to move on to, many of you may have heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. And then I'm going to speak about a very renowned author who talks about the tasks of mourning. Tasks of mourning, there's about 4 tasks of mourning, and each of us have to find where are we in terms of our task of mourning. And because that will also let you know, how much help do I need? Do I even need help? And let me just say this, not everybody who's had a loss requires counseling, but those of us who are stuck in our pain will find that our pain is manifesting in different ways that is different to who we know we are, who others know who we are. You'll find that counseling and just talking about the grief helps you. I also want to then speak to you about how does grief affect you, so that you notice the signs of symptoms within yourself, because it often doesn't show up as just crying and pining away for the deceased person. It can show up in a myriad of ways, right? And so in this way, we hope that this presentation is going to help you understand your own grief process. Now, grief is a natural response to loss. It can be a loss of a loved one. It can be a financial loss. It can be a loss of a partner because of divorce or relationship ending. It can be the loss of your home, like we've seen recently in the KZN floods. It can also be a loss of a job. But like I said, today I'm going to focus specifically on the loss of life. So when we feel something or someone, when we feel like something or someone has been taken away from us, it results in emotional suffering, right? It can appear also, grief can also appear when we lose something to which we have a strong emotional connection, which is often then associated with the loss of our own identity. A lot of people, when their father or mother has died, they feel like they no longer have an identity. Some people experience or grieve their freedom, the loss of their freedom, or loss of expectations, right? Grief should be a no judgment zone. Don't compare your grief to another person's grief. Your grief is different to what someone else is going through. Understand that, and don't behave in a way towards a person as though you understand what their grief is, because like I'm saying, your grief is totally different to theirs, right? But what we all want, when you've lost somebody, what you want is for your grief to be witnessed, right? You want other people to know that this is how insurmountable my pain is. This is how hurt and painful this is for me, right? What tends to happen is that people want to fix other people who are grieving. They're not broken, so there's nothing there to be fixed, right? But what needs to happen is that that person's loss, that person's pain needs to be honored. Their loss needs to be honored. We know during the coronavirus pandemic, we all experienced some form of loss and grief. There were so many different kinds of losses, some more difficult to bear than others. A lot of us, our loved ones are taken away from us quite suddenly. If they were hospitalized, many of us hadn't had a chance to say goodbye. We didn't have a chance to make up with them. We didn't have a chance to say we're sorry. So we were left with a lot of unfinished business and unresolved grief, right? And also, there was also social distancing, which disconnected us from our loved ones. We couldn't travel between provinces, if you recall. We couldn't go, visit people. I remember grandparents were cut off from their grandchildren. If grandparents died in that time, grandchildren didn't have that contact with them. So and also a lot of people were dying at, within a family. So that resulted in what we call traumatic bereavement, right? And multiple losses. And so aside from the loss of life, there was also the loss that we experienced in terms of our cultural practices, our traditions and our routines. If you remember how funerals were done, it was drive-by, it was done on the internet, and you watched a memorial. Only 50 people were allowed to attend, and these things keep us stuck in our grief process. These kinds of things that were imposed on us made our suffering even worse. It made the pain even more enduring, because it meant that we weren't able to pay our last respects, and we weren't able to adhere to the cultural practices and norms that we were used to. So what are some of the signs of grieving? When you are grieving, you will know you are grieving. Like we say, you are bereaved because you have this intense sorrow and intense pain like you've never, ever encountered before. Just think of somebody that you've lost and think about the initial time and what that felt like, the few weeks and the months, and how you ruminated over and over in your mind about conversations you had, things that you did, the memories you had with them, right? When we are grieving, we also focused on nothing else but the person who's died. We also focus extremely on some of the reminders. We may go into their bedrooms, we may hold on to their shirts or jackets, anything that reminds us of them. I know a mother once couldn't get over the loss of her son because he was young and he died all of a sudden. And there was no explanation about how he died. And she would go into his room and she would spray his perfume and smell that just to feel a sense of connection to him, right? Other people also have excessive avoidance of some reminders because the pain is too overwhelming and they can't deal with it. There's also intense and persistent longing or pining for the deceased person. And some people have a problem accepting the death, and we call this a complicated bereavement, and I'll go into that in one of my slides. Some people also have just a detached sense of being disconnected. They have from their emotions, from the deceased person, they have the sense of unreality, like it's not happening to them. They're just numb and they're devoid of any kind of feelings, right? So now I quickly want to go into the types of grief. Now, people always just think, well, there's just one type of grief. There's several different kinds of grief, and here I'm going to speak to about 8 of them. Anticipatory grief really is grief that is felt in anticipation of a significant loss, like somebody that's close to you that is dying from a terminal illness. Sometimes when you anticipate somebody dying, you may imagine starting to plan your life, without the deceased being present. And when you experience anticipatory grief, you may also start envisioning your life without that person. So not only do you plan your life around the person not being there, but you also imagine your life without this person. And that brings on a lot of sorrow and a lot of pain. And so, you focus around how you will respond to the loss or how you want to prepare for it when it does happen. So this at least gives you time, but let me just say to you that if you've had someone who's died of a terminal illness, despite knowing that they're going to die, it doesn't prepare you. Nothing prepares you for it, right? So don't be hard on yourself if you feel like I should have known, I knew, so I should have, been better at how I reacted. Nothing prepares you for that particular moment in time. The second one is complicated bereavement. Here, because the pain is so overwhelming, it actually prevents you from going about your daily life. It's like you don't want to live anymore. You don't want to live without that person. And usually complicated bereavement occurs long after the person has died, like a year, 2 years after the person has died, and you just have no will to live. And often this is a really concern for us because when it's unresolved, it leads to depression. In fact, people often come in with a depression, and when you start questioning them about their lives, you find there was a significant death which was not dealt with, and hence now the person has actually developed depression. The third type is delayed grief, and this is really when a loss, when feelings that you've had towards a particular loss do not occur immediately. Sometimes some people get stuck in shock or numbness, and they can't feel, they detach because it's too painful to acknowledge their reality. So the person remains in a particular grief stage. Some people even remain in denial for a long, long time. They will carry on with their lives, go to work and so forth, but they just can't do life without that person. So they will kind of disengage from life itself. So they'll say no, they'll isolate themselves and so forth. And this also, is a common delayed grief often occurs when there's too many losses at the same time. Chronic grief, now this is also when you have very strong emotions around grief, and it can be similar to complicated grief because it happens for years and years and years. And so this is not somebody who hasn't dealt with it. This is more somebody who wants to deal with it on a daily basis because they don't want to let go of their feelings of loss, right? People often experience chronic grief because they feel that if they stop grieving, it means that they're going to be disconnected from the deceased person. And we know that chronic grief is different from normal grief, right? Because feelings do not come and go, nor do they lessen in intensity. A chronically grieving person will behave as though the death happened in that moment, and they present with a lot of physical symptoms like headaches and migraines and backache and gut issues. And usually physicians can't find what the reason is, and it's usually because it's a chronic grief presentation. And the person who's grieving just has an incredibly difficult time with overcoming the grief, and they don't want help. They don't want to go for counseling. They don't want anybody to intervene. They just want to be the way they are. Inhibited grief, here the griever avoids facing the realities of losing somebody or someone by turning their attention to other things. Time and energy is displaced on something or someone else, and this is usually just a way of distracting. They don't want to deal with what's in front of them. They want to hide their feelings. They hope that if they hide their feelings, they don't have to face the pain. But this just makes you physically exhausted, and like I said previously, that somatic symptoms start showing up, like the digestive issues and the migraines and the headaches. And also this kind of grief, because it's inhibiting, it's done almost intentionally but subconsciously in a way. It also delays, it results in a delayed grief reaction. I remember once I had a lady who had lost her husband, and she came in with psychotic symptoms. And her symptoms was that she was talking to her dead husband. Her sons had brought her in, and she would said to me, he hasn't died. He sits next to me down in the bed. Every morning I put out his coffee and his cereal, and I make his lunch for him when he's going to go to work. She ironed his clothes, and this lady had a psychotic depression as a result of being unable to deal with her grief. Disenfranchised grief, this is usually, the kind of grief that's seen as not worthy because it's about losing a pet. A lot of people are attached to their pets, or even a non-family member or something that's a part of yourself. Like when people have a limb removed after an accident, they may grieve, and this is called disenfranchised grief. But like I said, society doesn't really support this or accept this kind of loss because it's considered not worthy of grieving or having pain over. It's like, get over it. It's just a dog. And for some people, they treat their pets as their own children, right? Cumulative grief, this is built up over time, and it results in several losses that take place in a short period of time. And the fatigue felt by many in the face of COVID pandemic is a type of cumulative grief that one would have seen. And also the same goes for collective grief. Collective grief is when large communities and groups of people experience the same loss at the same time, like the COVID-19 pandemic, the KZN floods, the civil unrest that we experience in KZN. These are all things, including war and terrorist attacks. This, even when we're not connected with each other or with the tragedy, we can feel what we call collective grief. So what are some of the symptoms of grief? Now, last time, if you were in my depression workshop, I told you about the difference between depression and grief. Remember, with grief, your symptoms are similar to depression. The difference is that with grief, it comes in waves, meaning that when something triggers a memory about the person who's died, like watching a television program, or maybe someone mentions their name, especially in the initial phase of part of the loss, in the first few weeks, the first few months, you might find that, you have a heavy heaving in your chest, and, you can't catch your breath as you are reminded of the loss. And you may cry at that point, but then tomorrow you fine again and you continue. And so your symptoms are not persistent and chronic. They're acute. Okay, they happen as you think about it. So there are different types: emotional, physical, and cognitive behavioral symptoms. With the emotional symptoms here, it's really around all of your feelings, like irritability may come up. You may find, like I mentioned, numbness. You may be bitter. Bitterness comes up for people who've lost loved ones as a result of suicide. It was tragic. There's a lot of anger towards the deceased because they chose to take their life. Sometimes we detach from the grief, from the pain, so that we can deal with our grief. Some people, on the other hand, become quite preoccupied with the loss, and others just can no longer experience or show any joy. With physical symptoms, it really is more in terms of how your body reacts to grief. And like I said, it may manifest for some people only in physical symptoms, and there may be no emotional symptoms. And here we're talking about chest pain, gut issues, digestive issues, headaches and migraines, just having, being tired and all the time, having low energy, your muscles and body aches and pains. And some people also have where they're not sleeping well at night, and they need to go on to sleep medication just to get them to rest a little bit. And so when you're experiencing these kinds of symptoms, especially in the early days of grief, you will know that you are grieving, even though you may not cry, for example, but you may have physical symptoms. So that will tell you, I'm not dealing with the grief. I once had a client whose father died, and she was a young girl. I think she was about 14 or 15, and she went to the funeral. When she went to the funeral, she collapsed. So by the time she came to the hospital, she was crawling in because she was paralyzed. And the paralysis was really her inability to deal with the death of her father. That's how overwhelming the pain and the loss was for her. Because on every scan, there was nothing wrong with her. So this was deeply psychological. And until she dealt with her pain, then only she started getting movement back in her legs. Cognitive and behavioral symptoms, this is really have to do with the brain and how it works in terms of its attention and its ability to focus and sustain. Sometimes there's inattention and distractibility. You may have brain fog, forgetfulness. You may find that you continuously worry inappropriately. You may have memory issues. You may also engage in some kind of substance abuse because your brain is telling you this is the only way to actually cope, or even under or overeat. You must know of people who comfort eat, for example, especially when they're experiencing any kind of psychological distress. This can also happen when you're grieving. So how does the brain react to grief? Well, the brain interprets grief, mind you, as emotional trauma, similar to PTSD. PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm sure you would have heard of PTSD, right? And what happens is that when there is a loss, it doesn't have to be traumatic. The brain interprets it as a traumatic. And the brain's perception of this being a threat means that it has to shift into survival mode, right? And it triggers the flight response. This in turn increases blood pressure, your heart rate goes faster, and there's a release of specific hormones. The grief and the loss affect the body and the brain by causing changes in your memory, your behavior. I just said that now, your sleep and other bodily functions. It may also affect your immune system. But most importantly, I think, is that you hear people saying, the person died of a broken heart, and people can actually die of a broken heart because they miss the other person so much, right? I said this about it also leading to brain fog. But what is the brain's goal? The brain needs you to survive. So remember, like in a traumatic incident like a robbery or a hijacking, your amygdala, which is responsible for the flight and fight response, shuts down. It gets hijacked. Okay, or sorry, your prefrontal cortex gets shut down and your amygdala gets hijacked. We say hijacked because the brain goes into survival mode. It does what it needs to do to protect you. That's its goal, right? But the good thing is that neuroplasticity teaches us that neural connections can be altered in the brain, right? So this allows our brains to compensate for any kind of illness or injury or other life-altering traumatic events. And this is done by forming new neural connections that are based on these experiences. And that is why therapy works, because of the neuroplasticity, because you can learn better coping skills. The brain learns how to make new neural connections that teaches it how to cope with whatever trauma that it's experiencing. Let's just go on to some of the myths of grief, because I think this is so important. Many people believe that, certain things keep them, and which keeps them from grieving fully or acknowledging their grief or resolving the grief rather. And so I believe that myths of grief tend to do this in a very bad way, in a negative way. And I wanted to just take you through some of the myths. So one of the myths is if you don't cry, it means you're not sorry about the loss. So when you're at a funeral and you notice the daughter of a person who died or the wife, you watch their reactions. And what do you say? Oh, she's not crying. I don't think she misses him much. But that does not mean maybe for you crying is a normal thing. Maybe for someone else, they're so much in shock or they're so numb. Crying is only one form of showing grief. Like I said, it's shown on the outside. What you do is grief is on the inside, mourning is on the outside, right? So some people may not mourn in front of you. Those who don't cry may feel the pain just as deeply as others, right? But they may have their own way of showing it, right? And because grief is something that we do on the inside, people don't see that. people think, well, I think she's over it because, you know, she's back at work, or she has a new husband or a new boyfriend. And really, I think how people grieve is, like I said, is as unique as your fingerprint. Another myth is that we must be strong. You will hear people say, be strong for your mum, or be strong for your dad, or be strong for your siblings. But this keeps us stuck. This keeps us not wanting to face our grief. It keeps us to engage in kind of pathological coping mechanisms that keep us from actually acknowledging and dealing with the grief. So, and the fact is that feeling sad, frightened, or lonely is a normal reaction, right? And crying doesn't mean you're weak. For a lot of males in particular, they will not cry when their mother or father has died, or a sibling has died, or a grandparent has died. They just feel, well, I'm a man, and it's not, you know, male-like to cry and to show grief. And that's why a lot of that becomes pent-up aggression, pent-up irritability, which gets displaced in the wrong way and on the wrong people, right? You don't need to protect. The responsibility is not on you as a male to protect everyone else. When you grieve, it gives everyone else permission to feel. It makes other people feel that it's okay to feel the way I feel, right? By putting up a brave front, you're not protecting anyone, right? What you're doing is that you're actually harming yourself. It's actually more helpful to show your true feelings. Another myth is that moving on with your life means that you've forgotten about the loss, you've forgotten about the deceased person. This may just mean that you've accepted the loss. You realize there's nothing you can do about it, and that you have to move forward. You know, with grief, we need to understand that grief is, you know, there's so many expectations about how we should grieve. You know, many of us are afraid of pain, but just remember, there's no way out of the pain except through the pain. And crying is a very normal response to sadness. And for me, I think it's important that you understand that when you move on, that you can move on with your life, but you can still keep your experiences, your memories, anything that you recall of the deceased person, you still keep those, right? Those are not lost. In fact, memories are the only things we actually hold on to, and it becomes an integral part of our lives after the person has died. It's, you know, pictures, any gifts that they've given us, anything, any memoir, a favorite song, any letter they've given to us, any WhatsApp message, you know, we treasure that. Another wrong myth is that grieving should last for about a year. Now, there's no time frame to grief, and I can't emphasize that more. You know, every one of us are built differently. Every one of us will react and deal with the grief in a different way. If you just look at your own self, and let's say you have lost a parent, and you and your sibling has that loss in common, how you dealt with the grief might be very different to how your sister or brother dealt with that grief, right? Or even when a friend has died at work. And really, this depends on your connection to the deceased. It also depends on your last moments with that deceased. You know, were you on talking terms? Did you have any kind of unfinished business between the two of you? What has complicated the grief process for you? It's not that you're over it within a year. Grief continues for a lifetime. It shifts in its overwhelming nature. It shifts in how much and how deeply you're affected. But to say that by next year, 2024, I'll be over my grief, and you give yourself that kind of time frame, this is not you trying to lose weight. This is a very different process, right? But remember that pain through grief is something that is inevitable. Suffering, however, is optional. And suffering is something that your mind does, right? Especially about the last days of the deceased's life, the images that you have in your mind, these can be really, really cruel to somebody who's grieving, right? And sometimes it tells us, well, you know, you keep on ruminating about the deceased person. You should be over it by now, right? But we do not recover from grief. But keep in mind that we recover in our own ways, in our own time. but also when we are grieving, it's important to acknowledge our feelings and really to talk about them. I think it's so important to constantly talk about your feelings to someone, obviously, that you trust, a friend or a cousin, or even a parent, you know, but holding it inside really prolongs it. Even though there's no time frame to it, it does prolong it. So I just want to speak a little bit about some of the grief and loss models. I'm going to focus on just one model because there's quite a few different, many professionals have come up with different kind of models and in terms of how people react to loss. And these models generally, you know, just map the grieving process for us. But I think one of the most famous ones is the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's one. Each of the models also explain how people respond to grief. Like some people do it through tasks, phases, or stages. But it's very useful in terms of the guidance it gives us on how to move forward and to know where we are at. But remember that the one I'm going to present to you now is not a linear model, because grief isn't linear. You don't go from one thing to the next, right? A lot of the models are also complementary to each other. And you choose, you know, what do you like from a particular model? What resonates with you? And then you can apply to your own life and your own grieving process. I think it's important to understand that grief is a universal process. No one is immune to grief. Everyone knows grief, right? And because it's a natural response to loss, it does help us to understand that when we experience negative feelings, that this is actually normal and that these feelings will go away. They won't be as intense. So the intensity reduces or decreases, and it does become less painful over time. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talks about 5 stages. She talks about denial. So when we hear about someone passing, initially we say, it's not true, it can't be happening, he was just alive, I just spoke to her yesterday. You know, so they don't want to believe it, and they carry on as though, for some people, denial can last for a couple of hours or even more than a day until the funeral and so forth, depending on what the rituals are. Sometimes seeing the deceased's body, takes you out of the denial. Some people go straight to anger. They get upset, and I see anger a lot with people who are facing the loss of somebody who died suddenly through an accident as a result of someone else being murdered, for example, or when they've taken their own lives, right? And then they question, why is this happening to me? Or they blame the other person, like when parents are facing the illness of a child and the child dies, and the one parent didn't want to get a particular kind of treatment done, they will then blame the other party. And a lot of marriages and relationships break up as a result of couples having to deal with a sick child. Other people, especially during the anticipatory phase, anticipatory grief, they will say something like, oh God, please, if you let somebody, if the so-and-so live, I promise you I will go to church every day, I will read the Bible every day, and so forth. Some people go straight into depression, and they just are lost to the world. They can't function. They collapse when they hear, and they have to be put on some kind of sedative so that they can just be okay and be present at the funeral. And eventually, this is quite a last phase, is acceptance of the notification of the death itself, and person tends to eventually make peace. Now, David Kessler said there's also a 6th stage of grief, which is finding meaning, right? Okay, this is just the 5 stages of grief and the different emotions that are tied with denial, like avoidance, confusion, elation, shock, and fear. Then anger, you might experience things like frustration or irritation or even anxiety. When you hear about someone dying, you can become quite anxious and afraid. So you might have all the anxiety symptoms. You might even have a panic attack. You might even hyperventilate, right? Even when you anticipated the person dying, when you hear about it, initially you may feel like you can't catch your breath, right? Then there's bargaining, and of course depression, where you struggle to find meaning and in terms of reaching out to others and even talking about your loss. And of course the last stage, as I said. So let's just focus a little bit on what David Kessler talks about his meaning, his 6th stage, which is he talks about finding meaning. David Kessler actually had lost many people in his life, his mother, and I think family members and his grandparents. And then he said he lost his son. And when he lost his son, and he's a psychologist as well, he struggled with the death. He says he still struggles up to today, years after the death, he struggles. But what helped him, and this is how he came to the 6th stage of grief, was finding meaning. Often we don't want to just accept, because we just feel like, why must I accept this? It was wrong. Why did it have to happen to me? Why am I being punished in this way? So when you find meaning, for you, it's wanting to seek that connection and wanting to get that closure, because finding the meaning helps us to transform our grief from pain and suffering into a hopeful and peaceful experience, according to Kessler. He says that this stage helps us to move forward in a way that actually honors the loved one that we've lost, and we remember them with love rather than with pain, right? And the meaning here comes from finding greater purpose after the loss. So if somebody has died from a terminal illness, for example, you might want to do something, start a support group for people who have died from cancer. You might want to do a support group. For example, it was a suicide death. You might want to start a support group for that. You do something that honors the memory of the person. You may advocate for finding ways to improve the lives of people who have died in the same manner. And this helps you then to move forward in your life, because now you're starting to find meaning. There's more hope, and your heart makes more peace with the person that has passed away. And he gives a nice excerpt here. He says, meaning comes through finding a way to sustain your love for the person after their death, while you're moving forward in life. That doesn't mean you'll stop missing the one you loved, but it does mean that you'll experience a heightened awareness of how precious life is. Right? So as I said, grief is organic, right? We do not need a model to tell us how to grieve. Often there's misinformation that comes from our traditions and our cultures that dictates how long we should grieve. But let's not just stick to the stages. The stages are mentioned to you as a way of giving hope, but also understanding of the self and your own grieving process, right? There's a lot of expectations around grief. Some of us are very afraid of our pain, but like I said, there is no way out of the pain except through the pain, right? You have to go through it in order to overcome it, to get to a point of acceptance, and then to find the meaning. So some people experience anger, a lot of anger for a very long time, and usually it's against their family and friends, right? Now, so this is normally due to some kind of biobehavioral synchrony. And this is really an incredible phenomenon where our bodies actually cinch up to our attachment, our attachment figure. So attachment is really about safety and security. It's about connection, especially emotional connection. And when we safe and secure, right, like babies, when they are going to have a secure attachment, what happens, right? They are able to calm themselves just by being near the mother, right? As human beings, we are relational. That means we are wired for attachment. And when somebody close to us, especially a parent, an aunt, a grandparent dies, these are our attachment figures. And when they die, our sense of safety and security is threatened, and it's taken away just like that, right? In a flash. And so the bereaved person may really feel very unsupported in their grief process, and this makes them very, very angry, and they take it out on others. They can take it out because they're angry at God sometimes, and because they're deeply religious, they don't want to, vocalize how angry they are to God, so they displace it onto other people. And when you're grieving, remember that your baseline energy usually gets depleted, so you don't have the same kind of energy, and so it may result in you, experiencing a difficulty trying to control, emotions like anger and frustration or irritability, and it may spill out into, for example, onto other people. Whereas, before the loss, you might have been somebody that was really calm, but you find now since the loss, you're this different person who is really just angry with the world and angry at yourself also, which takes time to actually acknowledge. And, the other thing that makes one very angry, if you've had a loss and you watch and you're grieving and you're in all this pain and you have no will to live, you become really angry when you watch other people carry on with their lives and you feeling miserable and you feel like the world is, just so unfair, and it's not, it's unjust. sometimes it's really hard to contain your resentment. And you're resentful because you watch others carry on with their lives, being happy and being having lots of joy in your life, and you yearn for that. And you wonder, why am I being punished? Why am I going through this? Why is the other person not going? There's so many things that keep you angry. Even if a total stranger on the road, you'll see them and you'll think, why didn't God take that person? Why did they have to take my loved one, right? I just want to touch a little bit on symptoms of complicated grief, because this is something that is a common thing that we see in our counseling rooms, where when grief fails to get resolved, for any number of reasons that I've now previously mentioned in the other slides, people may end up with a complicated bereavement. Usually this happens 6 months or even longer after the person has died. And it's really, mimics feelings of depression, which are usually intense periods of crying and then going on and on and on and thinking about the deceased person. You may also find that you're unable to keep your anger in check, and you are lashing out at people at work, you're lashing out at your family and your friends, you're even losing friendships over your irritability and anger. Some people even, when they have a complicated bereavement, come into our offices and, just feel they've lost the will to live, or they threaten suicide, or they say they've had thoughts of suicide because that life is no longer worth living. There's also an accompanying inappropriate guilt or even self-blame for the person who died. I didn't do enough. I should have taken them to the doctor sooner. If only I was on medical aid, I would have been able to get them the right kind of help. All this kind of inappropriate guilt feelings and thoughts come to mind. And also, if you have a difficult time keeping up your daily routine, like, you're frequently absent from work, you just are not able to keep your deadlines at work, you can't clean your house, you can't get out of bed. These are usually all symptoms of a complicated bereavement. Now, I just want to move on to a bit of work on the tasks of mourning. And really, when you're in therapy, your counselor usually looks at what are some of the tasks of mourning that my client have completed. Where in this process is my client? Has my client accepted the reality of the loss? So you might come in and say, complain about other odd things, but you will not talk about the deceased person. When your therapist asks you about your family history, your mom, your dad, your siblings, then the issue of a loss comes up. And your therapist might find it strange that you never mentioned that. She may also notice that when you talk about that particular person, your eyes gloss over and you become tearful, right? And she may see that while this person is having a difficult time processing the pain of the loss, or some people, have done number 1 and number 2, but they're not able to adjust without to a world without the deceased person. They just find themselves, constantly living in the past. They can't move forward. And so this is usually a sign that this person is at this stage. And the last stage, he says, we need to accomplish is to find an enduring connection with the deceased person. This is the part of the meaning, the meaning part that David Kessler talks about. So finding meaning and being able to move on and start a new life without the deceased person in our lives, right? And finding new connections with different people. You'll find sometimes widows can't move on, they can't go into relationships, and usually they're stuck maybe on one of these tasks that they need to complete in order to get to that point. So let's just look at these in more depth. So in terms of the task 1 of mourning, which is accepting the reality of the loss, often there's a sense of unreality when someone dies, right? Our minds in particular struggles to process the enormity of what has happened. So on one level, the more rational level, they've died, but then there's that emotional level where, you grapple and you're just not able to accept that the person has died. What you can do is try to talk about the person and your memories with them with someone else, right? And talk, even if you can't talk to someone else, write it in a diary, write it in your journal and talk about what you miss most about them. What would the two of you be doing right now if that person was there with you? It's, when you talk about the person, though, remember to talk about them in the past tense. And yes, you will have difficulty making the shift, but when you do that, it helps you to come to terms with the loss. And you really start accepting that this person is no longer here and they're not going to return, right? So just in terms of if you're not accepting the reality of the loss, talk to someone or write in your journal, talk about them in the past tense, and then your brain, remember I talked about the neuroplasticity, your brain starts rewiring and starts accepting that I have to let go slowly. This is like the first step, you know, slowly. It's not like when you get to this point, you must now immediately let go, but you're beginning to redirect your neural pathways to starting to accept the reality of the loss. Then the next step is to process the pain of grief. You know, in this phase, really, you may experience a number or several different types of emotions like sadness, guilt, anger, even helplessness immediately following the death. And in order for you to be able to accomplish this particular task of mourning, you need to be able to feel these emotions, right? Feeling, allowing and giving yourself permission to feel is part of the mourning process. In an attempt to avoid pain associated with the loss, some people may abuse alcohol. You'll have people working late. They may also start doing drugs or increasing their smoking because they want to avoid. Avoidance is a huge thing. So they try and just avoid the intense feelings, and they don't want to deal with the unpleasantness that comes with grieving. And for them, it's like, it doesn't matter. But remember that grief can and will resurface at unexpected times, especially if it's left unexpressed. And this can lead, and I've seen it many times, where it can lead to emotional difficulties in the future. So it's best dealt with, as painful as it is best dealt with. Talk about it slowly, you know, mention a memory, talk about how you're feeling. It makes me so sad that my father's no longer here. I'm so sad that my dad won't be at my funeral. I remember I was at grad, and one of the students there said to the VC, my mother's not here to witness this. That was very painful to hear, very, very painful. And you know, even as a total stranger, it tugs at your emotions to say that I wish for this child that her parents was here to witness, you know, to be a witness to this wonderful event. And those are the things that keep you stuck in your grief, is that when you have a child, when you graduate, when you get married, you know, when you buy your new car or your new house, the pain resurfaces, and you get angry all over again because you feel like, if only my dad or my sibling or my mom was here, they'd be so proud of me. You know, my child is going to miss out on having a granddad or grandmom. How can you process the pain? Allow yourself to feel the feeling. Don't chase it away when it enters your heart and your mind. Allow it. Just give it space and just let it be. Acknowledge it. If you can't cry, that's fine. Don't force yourself to cry because people say when you cry, you're actually grieving. No, but allow yourself to feel the feeling. Then find a way to express the emotion. And you can use poetry, you can use music, you can use drawing, writing. A lot of people find meaning in poetry where they write a poem about the deceased person as a tribute to that person, but it also helps them to process their pain. It also helps to talk to family and friends. And if you find that you don't want to speak to family, because, you know, normally it almost feels as though family doesn't understand your pain. They've moved on with their lives. You know, they're having Christmas and they're having Easter and they're having all the holidays. And here you are stuck in your grief, feeling miserable. And you don't want to go to them because you feel like they don't care, right? So then speak to a counselor. And I'll urge you to do so, especially if the grief is longer than 6 months after the person has died. The third task is usually the loss results in several external, internal, and emotional adjustments that you need to make. It also affects you at a deeper level. Your sense of self is shattered, and the way you see the world, the way you see others, the way you see yourself, and you can feel very alone, especially if you've had one parent. A lot of people grow up with their grandmothers, and when their grandmothers die, you know, it shatters their world, it shatters their sense of self, and they feel completely alone because now they've been orphaned. And so, you know, just take the time, try to process it and adjust to the changes without the deceased person. It can take a very, very long time to adjust to your world without the loved one being there, but surround yourself by people, right? Look at some of the losses and gains that are inherent in the death. You know, if your grandmother was really old and she was suffering, is that a gain for you? And at the same time, it's a loss of somebody you love dearly, but having her around would mean that you being selfish to want her around so that you're never lonely. but she will continue in her suffering as she's chronically ill, right? You can also adjust by, for example, getting involved in your church or your youth group and giving back to the community. Do engage in new activities that you never had time for because you were busy taking care of the person who was sick. And remember, sometimes when you're taking care of a sick person, it's really difficult to feel any kind of emotion because your mind and your body is so exhausted from all the caretaking. And so usually, and even if you don't know the person and you're a nurse and you're taking care of somebody that's like in a hospice or so, sometimes, it's difficult for you to let go of the deceased person because you grew quite close to them. You might have been the daughter they never had or the son that they never had. For some people, they want to give to charity or they join a pension group just to occupy their time and their mind. The last task of mourning is trying to find that enduring connection with the deceased person while you're trying to also embark on resuming a new life, your old life, or resuming a new life. Remember, to do this, it doesn't mean you have to forget about the deceased person. A person who you were close to and emotionally connected to will always be an important part of your life through your memories. You're just going to replace what David Kessler says. You're replacing the pain with the love that you had with them, and no one can ever take that away, right? Love continues, and it appears as sadness, and it appears as pain. Finding a way to remain emotionally connected to the deceased person can actually help you move forward in life without them. Some people feel, well, if I'm going to remain emotionally connected, it means I'm never going to move on. And that's really not the case. What else can you do? Do a wall of remembrance with them, do rituals around things that help you remember them. You can make a photo album about their lives and your memories with them. And you can look back on these in years to come. And usually, a memory box is a nice way to do a photo album in. You can also keep some of their photos on display if your religion allows it. You can also visit the grave if your religion allows it. And these are different ways in which you can connect to the deceased person. You can visit them on birthdays and holidays and special occasions. You can pay tribute to them. You can light a candle. And like I said, write a poem as a tribute to them. Anything that you feel is going to be meaningful. Right, so let's move on. We have a few more slides to go, not many. So there's no doubt that grief is terribly difficult, right? But it is doable. People have been doing it for centuries. And each of you, if you're grieving, those of you who are grieving, you will be able to face it, you will be able to confront it, and you will be able to move past it. But like I said, you have to move through the pain in order to get to where you need to be. And one of the important steps is start by facing your feelings. Acknowledge them, that I'm sad, I'm angry, I feel guilty. Whatever that emotion is, say it to yourself, all right? Acknowledging it is the first step towards dealing with it. Acknowledging it's the first way of getting to terms with the reality of the loss as well. Express your feelings in a very creative or tangible way. It doesn't matter what it has to be, whether it's a drawing, whether it's a poetry, but express your feelings. It could be teardrops. It could be somebody that's really, really angry. Find a picture on the internet that describes what you're feeling on the inside. Keep your hobbies and your interests. Make sure that you continue doing those. Grief is not something you do and then you continue with the other things. You do it alongside everything else. Going to work, meeting up with friends, going to a party. You still can be grieving, right? Because remember, it's something you do on the inside. Don't let anyone tell you how to feel, and don't tell yourself how to feel either. Just be. Right? Plan ahead for grief triggers. So if you're going to another funeral and your dad or your loved one was close to that person, it's going to trigger something for you. So plan ahead, that this is what's going to happen. I know I'm going to feel upset, so I'm just going to pop in for 10 minutes, pay my respects, and then I'm going to leave. Make sure that you're looking after your own physical health. Turn to people that you trust, whether it's a teacher or any other trusted elder for guidance. Anyone that you feel, I'm comfortable with this person. This person has been along with me on my journey and they know what I'm going through. So how do you understand your own grief process, right? These are some of the things you can actually do when you're trying to help yourself. Like I said, face the pain, acknowledge it, go to counseling. If you feel it's difficult for you to acknowledge it, you just don't know where to start, it's just too much. With counseling, you'll be able to develop some kind of coping skills. Your therapist will allow you or get you to sit with those feelings and talk to them. I saw recently a family who lost, I think it was 7 or 8 family members, within weeks of each other during COVID-19 last year. And this lady just didn't have any kind of, she had no emotion at all. Initially, I thought she was just detached. And there was so much I saw for almost a year, but there was so much that she was dealing with that kept her from not acknowledging her own pain. And what she was doing was she was displacing it on her marriage, on her children, and on her mother. And so it's important to be able to sit with those painful feelings, to talk about it in your session. And sometimes people who are not dealing with it benefit from medication, especially in the initial phases. It's not something you will stay on forever. It's just really maybe even a week supply or 2 weeks supply until you get to a point where you can start talking about your feelings. Some people are so crippled by their grief that they can't even talk without crying profusely. Understand that your grieving process will be unique to you, right? And don't forget to be kind to yourself. Grieving is not something that is linear. It's a process and it takes a long time. It's unique to you. It happens within its own time frame. Another thing that may help you to understand your own grief is if you join a support group. Find a support group. I know SADAG has some support groups, bereavement support groups, or start one at your own church, so that you can see that there are other people that are not only having fun in their lives. There are other people like you who are also grieving. Sometimes that makes us feel not so alone, because now we feel like, okay, so that person went through this. This is how they dealt with it. This person is where I was 6 months ago. I can actually help them and tell them how I got over it, right? So you learn from each other, you support each other. It helps you to feel connected, and it helps you not to isolate yourself from others. More importantly, make sure you're taking care of yourself, and that means exercise regularly, make sure you're eating, and make sure that you get enough sleep so that you can stay healthy and energized. Try to resume, like I said, your hobbies and interests and any kind of activities that really, bring you happiness and joy. Try to remember what that was if you can't remember now. And like I said, poetry is such a powerful but painful yet beautiful thing to do when you're trying to honor the deceased person. You don't have to be a poet to write poetry. Just write from your heart. Write from the gut feeling that you have about the deceased person. Talk about, and because this is another way of processing, right? I miss you so much. I don't know how I'm going to get through this. Life without you is never going to be the same, but I know I'm going to move on. Anything that you feel that provide, that is powerful, that helps you to acknowledge the pain, something that's beautiful about the person, what you would miss about them, try to start processing that way. If it's easier than talking to someone else, you can also move forward. Like I said, a wall of remembrance. You can get a wall in your home where you put up pictures of the deceased person. You can also create a memory box just with memories, letters that the person gave you, photos, print photos. And now we look on our phones, but you can print out those photos so that, you can go to these things when you are grieving. So you go to work, you come home, you cook, you do your stuff, and you may have a wave of grief. You can go to your memory box, take out something, a CD that has their favorite songs on it, play the song, anything that reminds you of them. Another way of processing and moving forward is to write a letter of goodbye to the deceased person and express your love, express how much you miss them, and address how them leaving has left you with this unresolved business. Ask for forgiveness, say that you're sorry, apologize, or whatever. Another way is to keep a grief journal, right? Sometimes people journal for a long time before they write their letter of goodbye. If that suits you, then you do that. And all of these things, your letter of goodbye can be kept in your memory box. Your poetry you write can be kept in your memory box, because each stage of your grief process is going to be different, and you start seeing how you've transitioned from a very, very intensely painful place and you see your progress with your grief work as you go along, right? Spirituality helps a lot of people. Some people remain angry with God, so they stop praying. So this might be something that you want to start doing again and reconnect with God and talk to God. Say, I'm so angry at you for what you did. God already knows what you're thinking. He knows what's in your heart. So verbalize it to him. Right? Say, I'm so angry at you. Why did you take my mother away? I already have nobody else and you've taken her away. Now I have nothing. And I promise you, in some way or the other, God helps you to realize that that's not true. That you don't have nothing. You still have God, for example. You have your spirituality. You have so many other things. You have your friends and other extended family members. Somehow or the other, that way of thinking starts changing as you speak to God. Create a piece of art in any medium to express your thoughts and feelings. You can do this individually. You can do it in your small friendship groups or any other group. When you need to seek help, well, when you get to a point of feeling suicidal and you feel your life isn't worth living anymore, if you felt that I should have died instead of the other person or along with the other person, when you continuously and chronically blame yourself for the loss or because you weren't able to prevent it, when you're still sitting with a lot of numbness long after the person has died and you're just disconnected from everyone and everything associated with the deceased person, and this is carrying on for longer than a few weeks, if you find that because of the loss, since then you're just somebody that doesn't trust other people because you just feel that people die anyway, so why get connected to people? They're just going to leave me. And also when you're not able to just, do your normal things, get out of bed and cook your food and go to work, then you know what, I need to start seeking help because I'm not in a good way. I'm not dealing with this. And you will know it's because of the death, right? Now, I just want to talk about this, this is sometimes often a thing that people get very wrong, or they get it really right. Sometimes we don't know what to say to someone else when they're grieving. We're so uncomfortable with grief. We just feel like it's something best avoided and we don't know what to say and we fumble and we say the wrong thing, right? But some of the best things you could say to somebody who's grieving is, I'm so sorry for your loss. I wish I had the right words. I just know that I care and I'm here for you if you need me. Never say, I know how you feel. Just say, I don't know how you feel, but I'm here for you in any way. Just, you know my number, call me whenever you need me, night or day, right? You can also say something comforting like, you and your loved ones are all in my thoughts and in my prayers. If you want to make small chit chat, you can say, my favorite memory of your father or your grandmother is this. Remember when we were kids, she would come and she would make fit cook for us, whatever the memory is, right? Just let your friend know that you're there, give them a hug. Sometimes words are not even needed. Just holding somebody, holding space for somebody and giving them a hug is enough. And say to them, it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to say nothing, right? Just make sure that the person knows that, time and words are not important, that if they just want you to sit with them, you're more than happy to do that, and you're a phone call away, they can do that. Things to avoid saying to somebody, or the worst things you could say is, at least she lived for a long life. She was 82, right? A lot of people die young. She's lucky she lived till such an age. Now, you don't know the deceased person and the meaning they hold for your friend. So don't say something as silly as that. Or things like, he's in a better place, he's not suffering anymore. When people die from suicide, a silly mistake people make is like, well, she or he brought it on themselves. Why did they go and drive so fast? Or why did they take so many pills? They knew that they were playing with their lives. Another way of kind of almost undermining or dismissing someone's grief and pain is saying, there's a reason for everything, God knows best. Avoid saying, aren't you over him yet? Gosh, he's been dead for such a long time now. When a parent has lost a child, parents say, at least you can have more children. Or when you do get pregnant again, they say, I knew the moment you felt pregnant, I knew you'd forget about the other one. And that's really insensitive. It's not taking into consideration that the parent might still be grieving that lost child. It's never, a parent doesn't get pregnant to replace the loss, right? They're just trying to move on with their life. Saying she was such a good person, God wanted her to be with him, or I know how you feel. that's not a good one. Even though you may have had a loss, remember I said everyone's experience of grief is unique to them. It's like their fingerprint. So don't say, I know how you feel. You can say, it's really must be so difficult. I don't know how you feel, but just know that I'm here for you. Another thing that people say is she did what she came here to do and it was her time to go. Avoid saying that. Avoid saying be strong. Being strong means don't cry. And what are you actually doing by saying that is you're preventing the person from acknowledging their feelings. You're keeping them in a state of denial and avoidance. So be careful of saying those kinds of words to them. And I want to leave you with these words. David Kessler says, remember where there is great pain, there was deep love. And grief, according to Joan Chittister, grief is a sign that we love something more than ourselves. It makes us worthy to suffer with the rest of the world. And remember that, according to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the reality is that you will grieve forever. The pain will be less, obviously, right? But you will not get over the loss of a loved one. You will just learn to live with it. You will heal. You will rebuild yourself around the loss that you've suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same, nor should you be the same, nor would you want to. Thank you. And we're done. This is our contact details for our Durban, Richards Bay and Wild Coast office, PMB in Newcastle, and our website if you need any kind of resources. This workshop will also be made into a YouTube video, and it will then be posted online for you to access the recording.